Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of BacklogBusters, where I'm busting out my gaming backlog one video at a time and letting you know if after all these years, these games are worth playing today. In this episode, Goofy and Max are finally dealing with the pesky pirate problem in Goof Troop. Why after all these years am I going back to play Goof Troop of all games? Well, there's been an overwhelming number of people in the comments asking for me to play Goof Troop on the Super Nintendo, so it's time to finally give in to the masses and check this game out. I'd never heard of this game before, and I've only watched a little bit of the show that it's based on, and I'm really much more familiar with the blockbuster film, A Goofy Movie, which was released in 1995 and had an amazing soundtrack from what I remember. But that doesn't seem to have anything to do with this game other than Goofy and Max being playable characters. So I was intrigued by the fact that this recommendation was a complete unknown for me, especially when co-op play was mentioned, so I picked up a copy and dove in to find out if this game is worth playing today. Goof Troop was released for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System on July of 1993 in the US, November 25th of the same year in Europe, and then a year later on July 22nd, 1994 in Japan. It was developed by Capcom, who already had several huge ongoing series like Mega Man, which would receive its 6th entry that same year, as well as the Street Fighter series, which saw Super Street Fighter II released in arcades as well. Which is part of the reason I was curious about this game, as Capcom is a big name just based on their own franchises, and I've heard great things about the Disney games that Capcom developed around this time for the NES and Super Nintendo, such as Aladdin, Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, and especially DuckTales, all of which received semi-recent ports to modern consoles and PC, but not Goof Troop. This was also the third game that the legendary video game designer/director Shinji Mikami worked on, who's now known for directing huge games like the first and fourth Resident Evil, the first Dino Crisis, Vanquish, and The Evil Within, to name a few. So why isn't Goof Troop ever mentioned in the same breath as these other games that Capcom developed for Disney, or even included in the same collections? I guess we'll just have to start playing and find out. This game starts with Pete and PJ being kidnapped by pirates, while on a fishing trip as Goofy and Max chase after the ship, eventually arriving on Spoonerville Island, which they must explore to find the pirate stronghold and rescue their friends. Knowing nothing about this game going in, I was surprised to have the game start up and immediately feel like I was navigating a dungeon from the Legend of Zelda series. You'll be moving room to room through a maze-like dungeon layout and have to complete puzzles or combat encounters to move on to the next room. Sure, in the early areas you're technically outside, but with wooden gates that block your path forward until they snap open after defeating the last enemy in a room or moving the final block into place. It's got a surprisingly similar feel. And you later end up in a castle and start picking up keys for doors, so the similarities get a lot stronger as the game goes on. There are a few different types of puzzles you'll encounter while exploring the levels, but most of them involve kicking very slick blocks around, which I've got to admit is much nicer than slowly pushing them in a Zelda game, but these aren't the most exciting puzzles to actually do, and you'll be kicking blocks into specific positions a lot for this game. One other puzzle type involves stepping on buttons in the right order. Another that crops up maybe 2 times requires you to spell a word, but it's really the exact same step on buttons in the right order puzzle, but with letters, with a few other types of puzzles cropping up later in the game. The Zelda comparisons don't stop there, with full-on boss rooms at the end of each level, and even some rooms that feature what feel like mini-bosses as you make your way through the dungeon. Most of the combat encounters and puzzles are simple, and they kind of give this game the feel of My First Zelda or Zelda Lite. But having a co-op game that lets you explore these types of dungeons with a friend or sibling is a really fun idea, and I'm sure that my brother and I would have had a blast with this back in the day. And although it's not to the same level of some other Disney games like Aladdin for the Genesis, which converted animations from the actual film it was based on, Goof Troop does look good, and it sounds good, and it has nice animations for all the characters as well. Thanks to Goofy and Max's incredible upper body strength, almost all the combat encounters in this game are solved by throwing heavy objects at enemies. Coconuts the size of humanoid dogs, no problem, use those to knock out the local wildlife. Precious vases made by the peaceful island inhabitants, smash them on the ground. Explosive cannonballs with lit fuses that knock lesser dogs off the level, just catch it with your bare hands and destroy the cannon that shot it. Goofy and Max could care less about how the island survives without any bees to pollinate it, with their insecticide of choice being the potted plants which attracted the bees in the first place. You can also squash enemies when you kick those greased up sliding blocks around, but for the most part, you'll be lifting and throwing. It took me a while to realize that you can actually catch projectiles too, which I did by accident the first time, and it really caught me off guard. Enemies also have this ability, which also really surprised me when one caught a barrel I threw, then tossed it right back at me and ended my adventure. This simple mechanic is actually pretty fun and unique, with you using items found around the environment rather than a sword, arrows, or other equipable weapons you'd find in other games. And the boss encounters make use of the catching and throwing mechanic for some fun and tense fights as well. Though I do wish that they did more with this, as later bosses and levels introduce some inventive new scenarios for you to use your pitching powers, but these aren't really expanded on or fleshed out more than in 1 or 2 encounters throughout the game. You won't be finding any typical weapons in Goof Troop, but there are several items in the game that Goofy and Max will acquire as they go, and you've got 2 inventory slots that you can swap various items in and out of. The first item you'll find is a rope gun, or hook shot for those counting Zelda similarities. And as with all games adding a grappling hook or hook shot of some sort, it's the easiest way into my heart. It can stun enemies in this game, pick up healing items, extra lives, even pull projectiles into your hands to throw. All of these things can be done an infinite number of times, but if you use the rope gun to connect 2 metal hooks, you'll actually create a rope bridge that consumes the gun and leaves you empty-handed. I really enjoyed using this item, and it felt like the game wants you to really plan when to build the bridge and use up the rope gun. So I tried to complete everything I could with the gun at my side, then build the bridge only after I'd cleared all other accessible rooms. So with the rope gun having so many uses, surely the rest of the items can be used for at least combat and traversal or puzzle solving. Right? Well, not really. The other items vary between having an infinite number of uses, like the bell that can be used to draw enemies into traps, which I found worked sometimes, but it was hard to get everyone's attention with the bell. Or the candle, that you don't even have to have selected in your inventory. It just lets you see more of the environment around you in the very few instances where a room's lights are turned off. Or the plank, which does nothing except take up an inventory slot until you use it to fill a hole. Or the shovel, which you can dig holes with, but only on very, very specific ground, and it really only digs up health items or extra lives. Which brings me to my first dislike. Why don't all the items have a secondary use? I had really high hopes when first picking up the rope gun and finding it could be used to interact with items, stun enemies, and more permanently as a bridge. I assumed all the other items would follow suit and that at least would have a combat use and a more permanent use. But no, the shovel digs, the candle brightens, the planks. The rope gun is the only real versatile item and the only item I ever really wanted to pick up. It just feels like a huge missed opportunity to me. Let's consider the candle. It lights up dark rooms, which maybe show up once or twice in the later levels. Even then, the rooms aren't pitch black. A candle just increases your viewing radius by a little bit. So several times I just ditched the candle in favor of an item I actually needed or liked better. But why can't the candle do anything outside of a dark room? Why couldn't it include an ability to light objects on fire to maybe solve a puzzle with burnout torches? Or attack an enemy? Or consider the shovel, which just digs up items and health. But if you don't need a refill, there's kind of no use for it. Couldn't the shovel have been laid on the ground to be stepped on as a trap like rakes in old cartoons? Or used to put out fires or fill a hole blocking your path with dirt? Who knows, maybe the developers tried this and it just wasn't fun, or maybe this game was made on a super tight budget or timeline, but there's just not much depth as the game goes on. The way you use the items and interact with the environment stays pretty simple, as it was from the start, throughout the entire game, with just a few different puzzles and enemies as it goes on. I think part of the reason that Goof Troop comes across as a simple game is due to its length. Now, in my review of Unpacking, I tried to explain my thoughts on game length, in that I don't really care if a game takes an hour or hundreds of hours as long as it's enjoyable to play throughout, and I don't feel like it's artificially lengthening or cutting off before it gets good or wrapping up the story. All of that to say, Goof Troop is not a long game. It's only 5 levels for you to play through, all of which go by pretty quickly. But the reason that it's in the dislike category is not because it's just 5 levels, it's because I felt like a lot of the ideas are just left on the table. One boss fight introduces spinning bone projectiles that you can't catch, but you can pull up from the ground to throw at enemies. But the game doesn't expand on this to introduce more skeleton enemies that throw body parts, or to introduce the ability to catch swords thrown by existing enemies, all of which could have led to some cool mechanics, rooms, or levels. As another example, most of the puzzles in this game are sliding block puzzles, but pressure plates are introduced later in the game, which you can throw items on to activate, which could have led to a whole swath of new puzzles. But no, it's only used in one level, and the idea isn't taken very far. The bell item also has an interesting puzzle based around it, where you shepherd an enemy AI to step on a pressure plate and open a door for you. But it's only used one single time in the whole game, and never again. Another unique puzzle introduced a controllable cannon that you can use to take out some enemies, which again is only used one single time. There's also the introduction of a conveyor belt, which slowly brings you throwable items as you dodge projectiles, or this weird remote-controlled platform thing, both of which, you guessed it, are introduced one time and never again. So why am I stuck almost exclusively doing sliding puzzles for 4 out of the 5 levels, when interesting ideas like this are introduced only to just be quickly thrown away and never expanded on or used for more variety throughout the game? I don't think Goof Troop is too short because of some arbitrary amount of time I think a game should last, but more so in the fact that it doesn't give itself the time to expand on its ideas and instead just cuts right off when new and interesting mechanics are introduced and starting to get you excited about what the next level might be. Now, with all that in mind, how did I feel about this game overall, and would I recommend Goof Troop as a game that should be on your backlog? Maybe. If you're looking for a breezy game set in a Zelda-esque dungeon filled with puzzles and just so happens to feature co-op through its whole adventure, something I'd love to see in more games, plus has catching, throwing, and rope gun mechanics that are surprisingly fun to use, even if the puzzles are a little simple. But I just feel like there's a lot of missed opportunities here, as 80% of the game is just sliding puzzles. The more unique ideas that they have are instead saved for the end and not sprinkled throughout, so they can't be expanded upon after they're first introduced because the game's over now. Maybe if Goof Troop had more variety or depth by making more than just the rope gun interesting to use, it would call for a higher recommendation, but as it is, I'm just a little mixed on it. And I'll throw out my normal message that my opinion on this game is not meant to tarnish any fond memories you have of playing this, and if you loved or still love this game, please tell me why in the comments below. I'd love to talk more about it and about the parts I really liked. Now, if you are interested in playing this game, there are sadly no modern options available, only the same old Super Nintendo cartridge that it released on. But what's weird is that on April 18, 2017, Digital Eclipse did release the Disney Afternoon Collection, which included DuckTales 1 and 2, Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers 1 and 2, as well as Tailspin and Darkwing Duck, and for some reason just skips over including Goof Troop. Even though it came out around the same time as those other games. I don't know if it's just because it was a lesser known game, or maybe it sold less than the others originally, but it is a shame that this game isn't available more readily in a collection like that. But that's it for this episode of BacklogBusters. Have you played Goof Troop? What did you think? Is it a must-play game that deserves to be on others' backlogs? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to talk more about it. And also, let me know if you have a suggestion for a game I should clear off my backlog next, and I'll work to make a video on it. If you enjoyed this video, please take a note from Goofy and Max and toss me a thumbs up and throw your mouse over to that subscribe button. And if you want to get alerted whenever I get done editing my next video, don't forget to use your hook shot on the bell icon. And as always, thank you all so much for watching, and see you in the next video. Bye.